Normally, when we imbibe today's alcoholic beverages, we seldom think about the means it took to get that liquid to the bar counter and down the hatch. From the far corners of the earth and spanning through different time periods, alcoholic beverages have come into existence just like tiny little miracles, all the way from Asia to Ireland to Mexico. Each one has a unique history, some being more mysterious than others. In this video, we will feature one of those companies and its feature brand Tusker, just so we can show greater appreciation for the journey they have been on. The history of Tusker can be traced back to when the British completed the construction of the Kenya-Uganda Railway in the then-Kenyan colony back in 1901. Due to the huge resources that went into constructing the Lunatic Express as it came to be known, the British received a huge financial knock, and coupled with the eruption of the First World War, the empire's fortunes in East African colonies somewhat dwindled. Faced with cash flow hiccups for bankrolling colonial programs, the Crown offered huge tracts of land and high adventure below the equator for its citizens and former soldiers immigrating to Kenya. One of those who took up the offer were brothers, Charles and George Hurst, two experienced farmers and budding gold prospectors. Initially coming to practice farming in the western Kenyan region of Kitale, the brothers' flax farming project failed, as well as their coffee crop, which was devastated by hail, while their gold prospecting business almost brought them to their financial knees. Having too much time on his hands, George became a party animal, occasionally frequenting Nairobi's newest hotels of Norfolk and New Stanley, where he hobnobbed with other failed farmers, successful entrepreneurs, soldiers, and game hunters. It was at one of these parties, a celebration marking the end of the First World War to be precise, that he realized that the toasting was being done using imported beer brought 6,000 miles by sea. That is when he got the idea of starting a brewery, and, in between drinks, he sold this idea to his brother and a friend. The three men contributed £2,500 each, and Charles left for England to buy some brewing equipment. He loaded them onto a ship and sailed back to Mombasa. In 1922, Kenya Breweries Limited was formally incorporated as a private company. In December of the same year, while holed up in makeshift tents, the trio established their stone and corrugated sheet plant on the outskirts of Nairobi, where the first beer was brewed with distillation done using firewood and copper vessels, while bottling was done by hand. The first 10 cases of beer were then delivered by an ox-drawn cart to the Stanley Hotel, where it was open to a mixed reaction. Sadly, in 1923, George, a big game hunter, was killed by a male elephant, commonly referred to as a tusker, for their huge tusks, and in his memory, his brother Charles decided to name the first beer brewed Tusker. 6 years later, in 1929, Kenya Breweries decided to start using malted barley in the production process, instead of imported malt extracts, significantly improving Tusker's appearance and flavor. The beer business continued to grow, and in 1935, Kenya Breweries acquired Tanganyika Breweries, an idea that was originally mooted 3 years earlier. Later on, Tanganyika Breweries Limited was established as a private company, and in 1936, Kenya Breweries Limited and Tanganyika Breweries Limited merged, leading to the change of name to East African Breweries Limited. Back in Kenya, the beer market was getting competitive, and in 1937, East African Breweries Limited got its first competitor in the form of Taylor's Breweries, which had opened in Nairobi. The brewery was run by the company's general manager, Mark Taylor, who had retired from East African Breweries Limited to start his own. In 1939, the Second World War broke out, and for the next 6 years, lack of raw materials hampered any form of growth in the sector. Even though the war brought in very thirsty soldiers, the troops were rationed to only 2 bottles of beer per man per week. Both the East African Breweries and Taylor Breweries Limited went through economic turmoil, but there was some hope after the war when the British government announced that it would settle most of its former soldiers in Kenya. On this promise, the 2 breweries expanded, and when the settlement scheme failed, the industry found itself with a serious overproduction capacity. It was perhaps due to this that in 1947, indigenous Kenyans were allowed to drink and sell bottled beer, thus opening a new market and saving the breweries from bankruptcy. In May 1948, Indie Coop and Allsop Limited acquired 49% of the Taylor and Company. From this acquisition, they would introduce both Pilsner and Whitecap into the market, giving East African breweries a run for its Tusker brand. The entry of this giant brewery brand into East Africa would significantly alter the local beer market with the expansion of Taylor's Ruaraka factory. But this expansion would also be hampered by the state of emergency declared by Sir Evelyn Baring due to the Mau Mau uprising against British colonial rule, and which went on for 6 years between 1953 and 1959. During these years, Allsop started making losses, and after recovery in 1961, its chairman H. Travis received a proposal in 1962 from East African Breweries Limited, which was seeking to purchase the brewery. East African Breweries Limited was interested in Allsop's brands, which by then were growing steadily, and that is how Allsop East African Limited was amalgamated with East African Breweries Limited to form East African Breweries Group. Allsop's shares were acquired by Kenya Breweries, which also acquired other breweries in the country, such as Nairobi Maltings and City Brewery. Suddenly, in 1966, Kenya Breweries founder Charles Hurst passed away in England. With no serious competitor in Kenya, East African Breweries Limited continued to register huge success, and in 1972, the company listed on the stock exchange by having the largest public share issue in Kenya then, when it offered 3 million ordinary shares at a price of 18 Kenya shillings, each raising the number of shareholders to more than 23,000. The public share issue was oversubscribed by over 500,000 shares. The late 90s to the early 2000s was a period of beer wars in East Africa, involving South African Breweries, now SAB Miller, and East African Breweries Limited. These wars ended in 2002 when East African Breweries Limited signed license agreements with South African Breweries International and agreed to terms for share swap in the subsidiaries of Kenya Breweries Limited and Tanzanian Breweries Limited. In 2000, global beer maker Diageo acquired majority control of East African Breweries, and in the following year, the group cross-listed its shares on the Ugandan Security Exchange. To date, the company has over 10 subsidiaries or associate companies straddling the whole of Eastern Africa and the Great Lakes region.